Before we get into this classic compilation of FPS videos made by me, I just want to say that CreatorVC's Kickstarter for their FPS documentary has now launched. At 3+ hours long and with 40+ names already attached and endless games set to be covered, it's aiming to be the definitive documentary on, well, shooting aliens in the face. But if you want to pledge, the link is in the description and the comments. And now, let's get on with the classic vids. Cheers! Here's a notable bad game that I won't hear a single bad word said against. It's Doom. Of course, it's not just any old version of Doom, but Doom on the SNES. Now, most people can take one look at this game and say, geez, what was the point of it? An experiment to show just how bad Doom would run on a 16-bit console, kicked out in stores for 80 quid a pop? You could talk about many things. The botched sound effects, the stripped apart levels suddenly bereft of enemies, the single-digit frame rate and comically low resolution. But I don't want to talk about any of that. Instead, I want to talk about owning an Amiga in 1995. Now, the Amiga's last days were very up and down, particularly for a late adopter like me who didn't get their A1200 until Christmas in 1994. On the good side, there's a huge library of great games and most of them are cheap. There's still a few good games to come and it's a damn fine computer in any case. On the bad side, well, where's Doom? Now, this channel is often dedicated to the European perspective, where certain things could be markedly different from what is often perceived to be the norm worldwide. For example, Nintendo not being the top dogs over here. In the case of Doom, I don't have to do that. People here were crazy for Doom just as they were everywhere else. Come the end of 1993, when magazines finally got around to reviewing it and dishing out the customary high 90s, it was pretty clearly the game to end all games. There had been nothing like it before and somehow, one way or another, you had to play it. Drop all this microcomputer bollocks if you're still into it, sell a kidney, buy a PC and get yourself some Doom, because that's the only way you're going to be able to do it. But us Amiga folk are nothing if not hard-headed, and so we waited for news. Surely Doom was going to arrive on the Amiga before too long. How could the king of all computers just be ignored? But no. What we couldn't see is that by the time Doom became a phenomenon around 93-94, the Amiga was already slowly dying. Commodore itself was soon to be dead if they weren't already, the computer was in a lengthy limbo that it would never get out of, and with no new computers on the horizon, studios were gradually leaving the Amiga behind. id Software themselves had no interest in putting Doom on the Amiga. Hell, they were Americans and the Amiga as a commercial computer had already been dead for years over there, so why the hell would they? That was the sad truth. But of course we couldn't see that, we wouldn't listen. And so there were two questions that Amiga mags received in their thousands in every month's mailbag back in 95. How do I get the internet on an Amiga? And will we ever see Doom on the Amiga? For the latter, well, mags probably wouldn't want us to see the truth on that one either, if they themselves were even able to face up to it. Gotta keep the hype up somehow, otherwise what'll happen to the already dwindling circulation? In the absence of Doom, several tried to offer alternatives: Alien Breed 3D 1 and 2, Gloom, Breathless, various others, and they were noble and often really freaking good on their own merits, but obviously they lacked the name or, by the stage they came out, the audience. Doom would eventually see an Amiga port, but not until 1998 when multiple versions came out after the release of the original source code. Hell, you can play Doom on just about anything these days. But not on the Amiga in 1995. But then, for those of us who couldn't experience the game on PC as intended, there was a slight form of salvation, and it lay in this game, this much knocked and in hindsight clearly poor port of Doom for the SNES. Maybe some people had this experience on the 32X too, or the Jaguar, or any other machine that received these quite bad ports, who knows. And yes, it's not very good. Playing it for this video for the first time in over a decade, I certainly recognise how unresponsive the controls are, how slow the game is, how the resolution turns everything into a massive mess of pixels. The music is still kicking, mind you, but clearly Doom is too much for the SNES to handle, a ludicrous overreach. But back then, for those like me who weren't able to get the PC version yet, It was something. A chance to bask a little in the glory of the game that everyone else was talking about, and perhaps the last big cry of the port that isn't anywhere close to the original, but manages to get something of its essence. And somehow, once I readjust to the game's crap factor, even knowing that I have the option of playing HD resolution versions of the original to hand, I can still feel that a little bit in William's stupidly ambitious port. Of course it was hideously expensive, so I never actually bought it, but whenever I could I would rent it and play it to death. It was a sliver, a taste of things to come. Soon enough you would be able to play Doom as intended. Until then, this would do. SNES Doom may not be a good game, but it is a strong game in memory. Now soon enough didn't come until 1997, when the family finally got a cheapish second-hand PC. A couple of years old by that point, not all that good in the first place, ostensibly for office work and no internet. But yes, it could run Doom. I don't even remember how we actually ended up with Doom 2, whether someone bought it or more likely a friend had a copy and installed it or whatever. But finally it was there, and after all the years of hype, it was everything that I thought it would be and more. The quest for true Doom was over. A couple of years after that I managed to find a Doom 95 box at a boot sale with both Doom 1 and 2 and Final Doom on it. And well, that was definitely it by then. Played for hours, many hours, all the original episodes, all the WODs I could find on the internet, everything. Still replayed every now and again as a true classic should be. As ubiquitous, famous, and indeed maybe surpassed as it is, Doom 1 and 2 remains my all-time favourite first-person shooter. Doom 2 in particular holds such a special place in my heart as one of the greatest sequels ever, and one of the most intense and flat-out scary games I have ever played. It's perfect. Few games are tough in the way that Doom 2 is, when you always feel like you're just scraping for a stage, when you just about manage to kill that heavy weapons dude with a bullet and a sliver of health to spare, when you reach the exit only to find a pair of Caker demons coming for you, when almost any mob is a potential threat due to just how much damage you take, and you can barely see a bloody fin most of the time. There's many times in Doom 2 where you just feel like you're utterly screwed, when you're just about to open a new door with virtually no ammo and the desperate, bloodied face of your marine is twitching with dread. If you're lucky, there's just a shotgun guy behind that door. Maybe there'll be a few imps, perhaps a chain gunner if you're quite unlucky, possibly a Hell Knight if you're just completely unlucky. Pause, deep breath, go. Sometimes you die and you have to restart the level from the beginning. But when you survive, there's nothing quite like it. My first proper PC gaming experience, and it couldn't have been much better. Doom on the SNES was a taster, but this was the real deal, the full-blown dose. One of my favourite games of all time. And so we basically jump forward almost 20 years. Doom 3 isn't really part of the equation, because I've never played it. The PC I had at the time wasn't nearly strong enough to run it, and by the time I had a PC that was strong enough, I wasn't really interested in it. From all I'd heard, the game didn't really play much like the Doom I knew, so rightly or most likely wrongly, I never touched it. So these days it's just another entry in a big old backlog. Again, Doom seemed to fade away a little, obviously never into total obscurity, but it was more like the Monty Python's Flying Circus of first-person shooters, the one that was massively influential, but had surely been surpassed by better models many times over. That was usually the consensus. Make sure you play it for the history value. But, you know, modern games are so much more immersive and better with so much more to do and shit. That seemed to be the general opinion anyway, although hardly mine. I always thought it was great to play regardless of anything. Judging by some more recent games though, I wasn't alone in that. Before we get to the new Doom, we kinda need to think about the best way to look at it, to build up to it. It would be easy to say that the new Doom represents a glorious return to all the things that old FPS games represented. The big arenas, rejecting cutscenes and cover mechanics, theatrical splashes of blood, ridiculous weapons and so on. In a way, this is how you can take Doom 2016 and be happy with it, and such an approach does fit in with how successful the game was. but it also does the game a bit of a disservice as it's a lot more complex than that. Title aside, Doom is a very modern game that represents a changing of the guard, but it's also the start of another chapter in a decade or more's fighting over what best represents the FPS as a genre. And going through all of those gimmicks and trends would obviously take an age and would take us way past the point of this video and beyond. It's easier to sum up the newer games that represented the old ways, so to speak, before Doom 2016, and see how they fared. 2011's Bulletstorm is one of Doom's closest relations in play, because it encourages you to play very fast and with as much of a flourish as you can. You get so much more out of the game when you're running around, dodging bullets and putting combos together. You get so many tools that are based around sliding into enemies, kicking them forward into barrels, shooting them and taking out a whole mob in the ensuing explosion. That's the game basically. It rewards flair, variation, style and above all, risk-taking. This style of play was completely off trend at the time though, and a lot of people instead played Bulletstorm more like one of many cover-based shooters that were around back then. It didn't go far enough as it still kind of had those options to hand. At the time it reviewed very badly and sank like a stone, but over the years it has gained a cult following, to the point where Bulletstorm, a game that flopped hard, is getting a remastered edition this year, something that's usually only bestowed on the likes of The Last of Us or BioShock, the biggest games of the last generation. In the same year, Duke Nukem Forever, another representative of the old school, came out. And yeah, we know how that went. A disastrous flop, an examination of just what over 10 years of overspend, feature creep, studio problems and just plain bad luck can do to a once loved game that now simply didn't have a clue what it was supposed to be. It was quite deservedly shunned. The one positive about the resurfacing and capitulation of Duke Nukem Forever was that it opened up a path for some of Duke Nukem's contemporaries to get back into the action, on the grounds that they could probably do a better job, which indeed they did. 2013's Rise of the Triad is a pretty straight-ahead remake of Apogee's 1994 classic with very little changes to the mechanics. The gameplay is much the same, the health systems and whatnot are much the same, the first-person platforming, naturally, is the same, and the presentation is obviously updated but still similar aesthetically. Not a massive game by any means, but a lot better than Duke Nukem Forever. This game is a very proud throwback that shuns just about everything that happened in the FPS genre after the release of the original Rise of the Triad. The same though cannot be said for another game that released in 2013 and featured a member of the old guard. Shadow Warrior does do those basic old school things, covers a dirty word here, as is anything that potentially makes the game slow down, but it's a totally new game, one where it's infinitely more fun than it was before to simply slice and dice with the sword. And like Bulletstorm, it rewards you for how well you fight and how varied your attacks are. It's a pretty freaking good game all told. A successful one too, meaning that all of a sudden Shadow Warrior, a game that was, to be honest, just one of many build engine FPSs in the late 90s, is now a big name in the FPS genre in a way that it wasn't even when it came out originally. Of course, another thing that can't be forgotten in all of this is the Doom scene itself. People have been making levels, episodes, total conversions of Doom in their thousands since 1994, and they're never likely to stop. The release of the source code for Doom means that no matter what, there will likely always be a very easy way for modern computers and operating systems to play Doom, thanks to source ports like ZDoom. Even if you've somehow never played the original Doom before, it's very easy to do so in thoroughly ass-kicking Full HD, no DOSBox required. And every now and again, a mod comes out of the scene to receive plenty of attention. 2010's Brutal Doom is a good example of that. A game that's basically the original but with revamped enemies and weapons, a whole shit ton more blood, plenty of executions, and the ability to tell cyberdemons to go fuck themselves. The mod received a lot of praise at the time, and did have long admitted that they were looking at the likes of Brutal Doom for inspiration when creating the new game. And then at last you have the return of Wolfenstein, a series that had had its own ups and downs over the years. Following the success of its first reboot, Return to Castle Wolfenstein, 8 years passed between it and 2009's second reboot, simply called Wolfenstein. A game that had its ups and downs, was seen as a bit of old hat, didn't sell well at all, and resulted in the gutting of long-time id collaborators Raven Software. But another few years pass, it'd pair up with a new company called Machine Games, and in 2014 they release Wolfenstein: The New Order. And shock of horrors, it's bloody brilliant. Modern as all hell, but it's got that old school vibe. Big bosses, lots of enemies, tons of firepower, tons of movement, secrets. It feels like you would expect a modern Wolfenstein game too, and it actually ends up selling pretty well in the bargain. It is certainly appropriate that a new Wolfenstein game comes around just before the release of a new Doom, a connection further exploited by the New Order offering access to Doom's beta, bringing us neatly onto what the general impression of the new Doom was before its release. Now, history probably won't record a lot of the negativity that surrounded 2016's Doom. It was pretty well known that the fourth Doom game had had a very troubled 8-year development. Originally known, appropriately enough, as Doom 4, the game had at first been pushed as an urban, more military-style shooter, to the point where some had dubbed it Call of Doom. Reaction to this new direction for Doom was almost wholly negative, and eventually the whole thing was torn down and started again. When Doom resurfaced in 2014, it promised a return to what had made the series great in the first place. We're back on Mars, we're going to hell, and we're shooting all the things along the way. Oh, and the game had lost the 4 as well, it's just gonna be called Doom. However, none of the video from the game showed it at its best. It looked like a very basic shooter, and kind of a brown artless mess at that. It looked repetitive in the ways that the original games weren't, just one monster after another getting gibbed forever. Reports from the beta didn't exactly generate much hype either, seeing as it was based around the thing that would eventually become the new Doom's weakest aspect by far, the rather bare bones and outsourced multiplayer. And Bethesda, the new publishers, in what has become their typically controlling style, released no advanced copies of the game for review, usually a huge warning sign that the game itself is a total dog and the publishers applying a bit of damage control. Get as much sales as possible before the rubbish reviews start pouring in, and then get the hell out of there. Even the cover art was seen as a terrible sign. A small thing perhaps, but Doom 1 and 2 had some of the most iconic cover art ever seen in a game. This game, well, it didn't. In fact, it could have been the cover of almost any also-ran FPS released in the past decade. The new Doom did not, in any way, look like it was going to be a great game. Hell, it didn't even look like it was going to be good. I was pretty much nonplussed by everything I'd seen, set to pretty much ignore its release and just stick with the old games instead. And then, of course, all of this turned out to be wrong. Doom represents a very new approach to the FPS, although one that still has a lot in common with its forefathers. Story is pretty minimal, although it is there. Cover, most importantly, is non-existent. There is virtually nowhere to hide from enemies. There's a lot of platforming once again. And there's no regenerating health as such, although health is tackled in a very fun way. And like old Doom, there's plenty of secrets to find in levels if you go looking for them. A lot of the big modern touches in Doom are ones like that have survived over the years, or the addition of miniature challenges, say killing 3 guys with 1 shot that fit the style of the game pretty well, or upgrading your marine, although usually the options here are only designed to assist with the slaughter. And well, the slaughter is where the game is strongest. This game is an incredible evolution of how Doom plays. The best gunfights in Doom were always so physical. Sometimes you had a bit of cover to rely on, which could be useful when dealing with the game's hit scan enemies. But a proper fight with little cover is all about dodging, sidestepping, circle strafing, running, all the while causing as much damage as you can, using cover sometimes but only to get the drop on an enemy, not to hide away, because if you stay in cover for too long, they're just going to come after you. New Doom, a game that does away with cover almost completely, ups the ante even further. You simply have to go on a rampage, running around, dodging enemies, taking hits to give hits, stick and move, rip and tear. It's the only way. And it is brilliant. I'm not sure if I can think of another shooter that gives you such a good feeling through most of its fights, simply because you're basically never standing still. Indeed, if you are standing still, then you're in trouble. A big part of this is the new glory kill system, the greatness of which can be hard to explain because it doesn't look all that good when you're watching it. The core of it is that when an enemy is stunned or near death, they flash and you can quickly execute them. A very short scene plays where you, say, punch their head off, break their neck, tear their arm off and bludgeon them with it, and so on. It's something that can be found and was undoubtedly inspired by Brutal Doom, although you can also trace it to other games. Executing everyone you can is a big part of Ninja Gaiden, for example. It doesn't look great in motion for various reasons. When watching it, you wonder if it slows the game down, or if it takes the player out of the game, or maybe you think that the constant executions become repetitive and so on. But when playing, you just absolutely get it. Glory kills are so important as every one of them drops a little bit of health, rewarding risky play even further. When you're playing on the higher difficulties, they are essential. One thing I love about these glory kills is that they make melee attacks so important. They're great for parrying imps, or just instantly glory killing basic zombies. They're pretty much only there to be glory kill fodder in the first place, but it's so much easier, and a lot more fun, if you simply run up to them and whack them instead of trying to shoot them first. The glory kills just work totally. All of this helps to make the gameplay pretty damn great, as there's simply nothing like a fight in this game. And once you play it, you absolutely get it, this cocktail of constant movement, always dealing with enemies in so many different ways as the play gets harder. It's unreal. But there's plenty more goodness here. It may well be the most refreshing first-person shooter in years, but there's more to that than just gameplay. There's the presentation too. Doom's world is gorgeous, with colours so vivid that you're afraid the game will burn itself into your TV screen forever. The external parts are that damn red, and the insides of the UAC labs are suitably dank, with the fantastic lighting you come to expect from a Doom game. And that's all before you get to hell itself. It's a striking game visually, and it moves great too. It seems like no matter what you play this game on, it just moves without even the slightest hitch. But as good as the graphics are, the sound is something else. Sound, again, was always a very important part of the original Doom. Sure, it was just a few low-quality sampled effects, but they were always playing, and they made you feel like you were at some sort of feast. As long as they were playing, you knew that a monster was close by. Not knowing where they were made things even worse. And then the sound of a monster noticing you makes things even worse than that. You always have to be listening out in Doom. If the first time you become aware of a monster is when they start firing at you, then you're screwed. As in most areas, the new Doom takes what worked before and ups things considerably. What was once a few low quality samples now becomes a multi-layered cluster of moans, screams and guttural cries, but both are effective for the same reason, and there's enough going on in the sound alone to ensure that you just can't rest easy even for a split second. I also like the occasional callbacks, the subtle sounds such as doors opening and closing that are very familiar, but not so overdone as to be obvious. The music itself does a job too. While there's no song that's ever going to stick in the mind in the same way that the best of Bobby Prince's music does, it's more dynamic. It's always adding to the tension in the quiet moments, before simply exploding in the fights, smashing you about the face with these genty industrial blast beats. A great soundtrack to all the carnage that's going on that really helps the game get a rhythm going. It may not be something that you can hum, but it sure is something memorable. Now, all of these things are brilliant technical things. The way the gameplay builds on what worked before to make something new, the graphical beauty, the level and the sound design, and how it all comes together to make a great single player game. Having played it properly, I'm happy to say that it quite obviously wiped out my default choice of FIFA as my game of the year. And I'm hardly alone. When the game hit, word of mouth spread pretty quickly about just how good it actually was. It ended up being a big hit, nominated for plenty of awards and getting several Game of the Year nods. It's unquestionably a big success. But how special is it? As brilliant as it is technically, as successful as it's been, the hardest question for me is simple. Does it deserve to be mentioned in the same breath as Doom 1 and 2? Bearing in mind how special those games are to me, and how I don't think any other first-person shooter since has managed to offer what those games did. Not that others didn't succeed just as much for different reasons, but the Doom mix is special. Is the new Doom up there? I struggled with that question. and the hype machine that built around it only made it tougher to answer. But on playing it properly, I've got to say that the answer is, indeed, yes, it does deserve to be up there. But still, why though? It's difficult to pin the moment down when New Doom became something on the level of the old games to me, and it can feel somewhat arbitrary. Was there really something about that one mob, that one gore nest? The 221st glory kill just felt that much better than the 220th? There's also the odd moment that feels iconic, right down to the Marine punching the crap out of a monitor as a bad guy gives a very typical "we can be friends" spiel in the beginning of the game. An awesome statement of intent and a definite harbinger of things to come, but after everything I've talked about, it would be quite silly to give that honour to a cutscene. In the end, some fights are better than others. Like a desperate rush backwards down the stairs while a Hell Knight's charging towards you, something that shows just how good the design of the game is. You may have literally just walked into this area, a place that you've never seen before in your life, and suddenly in it you're fighting this demonic bastard, and you just know where to go. The fight against two of these at the end of the third level is another keeper. A big arena, constantly moving, plenty of running interference, and again you just know. You just keep running, you react and you adapt constantly, and so many fights in the game give you this feeling. But the one that really clinched it for me came at the end of the fourth level, your second encounter with a summoner. Summoners speed around arenas, shoot fire and naturally lay summon reinforcements. Basically they're the game's version of an Archvile, one of Old Doom's most feared enemies. I kind of cheesed my first encounter with one of them, getting lucky with a couple of launcher shots and dispatching it in pretty short order. But in the second encounter I'm not so lucky, and it's all down to me and him. He's fast and painful, punishing any misstep with a stream of flame that's very hard to dodge. Just like the old days, it's stick and move, the scantest moments spent in cover before I try to track him again, but I can't get all that much damage, and soon I'm all the way down to 1 unit of health before eventually, maybe even slightly luckily, I zig past the fire, hit an explosive shot, and rush the dazed summoner just in time for the most satisfying and most glorious of kills. That, in a nutshell, is the Doom I know. Not just the Doom that I experience whenever I revisit the game, but the Doom that I see in my mind's eye whenever I think about how good the game is. The mega mix of all the best things about the game rolled into one that makes me grin like a Marine with a BFG 9000. And this new Doom managed to capture that feel perfectly. And in the end, how does it feel to realise that 24 years after that first trip to hell, Doom is once again right at the very top of the tree? It's pretty amazing to think that not only is it once again the king of single-player FPS games, but that the ground was even set for it just a little by a Wolfenstein game. And that again, it may not have been the first to do all of the things it does, whether it's bringing back arenas or having lots of platforming or reveling in glory kills or whatever, but just like Doom, it was the best combination. History certainly has a habit of repeating itself. Still, coincidences like this don't matter too much when the game is this good. And hey, sometimes ripping everything apart and starting again is a good thing, believe it or not. Because who on earth would have wanted to play the urban military style Doom that he'd originally envisioned? For now, Doom is, once again, the best. Sometime down the line, maybe sooner than you think, maybe a few years from now, it'll be back again. Expectations may vary. Trailers may be poor. Betas may be disappointing. Front covers may be rubbish, but it still can't ever really be counted out, because with Doom, anything is possible. Bye for now. Just how incredible was the orange box? Seriously, when you think of bundles of software, it's kind of up there. Of course, it did have the original Half-Life 2 and Episode 1 together in one pack, but look at the 3 other bits of software it had. Team Fortress 2 was on there, the long-in-development sequel to one of the most popular HL multiplayer mods, and 10 years later it's still one of the most popular multiplayer games around. A completely unknown game called Portal, with no hype, produced a puzzle FPS that was a single-player experience unlike anything that had come before. And then there was Half-Life 2 Episode 2, The latest instalment in Gordon Freeman's story, the one new game where we basically knew what to expect, and it delivered on those high expectations. There was one thing we didn't expect though, that 10 years later, it would still be the last time we've seen Gordon Freeman, leaving one of the biggest cliffhangers in gaming entirely unresolved. Half-Life is one of my absolute favourite series. I replay all the games fairly often and consider them alongside Doom and Call of Duty 4 as basically the premier examples of how good an FPS can be. Playing the original game in 2000, when I first got a decent PC capable of running it, was revelatory, and I still get that magic now. But I'm somewhat curious as to where the series stands today. Its reputation as a classic and highly influential series is surely set in stone, and yet it's not one that gets talked about all that much. The current status of Half-Life itself doesn't help matters. Something has been left unfinished for a decade now, and more than ever it seems as though people at Valve just aren't interested. Is there anyone there who wants to work on Half-Life 3? Is there anyone even there anymore who worked on Half-Life 2? Who knows? We'll get to all of that, but I kinda want to look at Half-Life again, to see how Valve made it, to see how it still influences games today, and also to ponder just how good Half-Life is now. Is it still, in the year of our Lord 2017, a game that's worth playing? Most of you might know a little something about Half-Life's early days and the way that Valve works. The original aim was a horror FPS in the vein of Quake, using that game's engine, with a much swarthier looking lead character who was originally named Ivan, not Gordon Freeman. He kind of looks like a Scottish NPC in a bad JRPG. Survival horror was a big part of Valve's ambitious ideals for the game, but they wanted to do this through the building of a proper world with characters, not just a load of monsters. The world building is what would drive Half-Life and make it a very ambitious project, one that most publishers balked from until Sierra came along and signed Valve up to a one-game deal. The first result, set for release in late 1997, innovated in several areas but was not cohesive enough for Valve, so they decided to go back and rework everything in order to bring it to a whole. They did this with the help of the so-called Cabal, a group of 6 who would meet almost every day for 6 hours, and each time they would go through one aspect of the game at a time in intense detail, from the laying out of levels to the designs of the enemies and everything in between. Programming took these ideas and bashed them into existence. A writer, Mark Laidlaw, was employed to ensure a consistent storyline, and over the course of one seriously intense year, the rough elements of Half-Life became whole. On its November 19, 1998 release, it was a game changer. No FPS had done what Half-Life had done before it. None had managed to marry story and gameplay in such a way. None had made you feel as if you were inside the game as much as Half-Life did. Now, there are a couple of key rules in Half-Life's design that guide just about every level in the series. Firstly, the player sets the pace of the level. Every level in Half-Life has a lot of things that happen, events that dramatically change the layout of the level, or put Gordon in a different situation, or put him in a major shootout, or send some poor scientist to a grisly end. We'll break this down in a bit, but they are all controlled by the player and happen in close proximity to them, or by the player's own trigger. The player is warned if they are in immediate danger, and the level responds to basically anything that the player can do. When you shoot a bullet into the wall, it leaves a mark. That seems like such a small thing now, but how many FPSs featured bullet hole decals in the wall before Half-Life 1? But that first part is what's important. The player sets the pace. Half-Life, for the most part, is as fast or as slow as you want it to be. Of course, there's one time where the game does dictate the pace to you. The opening, in which our 27-year-old MIT graduate hero, Gordon Freeman, rides the train to work. He's late. Leaving aside how this sort of world building and atmospheric sequence hadn't been done before in an FPS, there's still a lot of things happening here. Getting the sight of a chopper landing, some scientists banging on the doors, heavy loaders moving equipment, all those announcements, and of course our first sight of that strange looking suited man. Every on-rail sequence like this since follows much the same formula. Call of Duty 4, 9 years after? You're a deposed ruler, and this ride through a city under control by a separatist group is going to end quite badly for you. This sequence is exceptional, Half-Life's is purposefully mundane, but both have the exact same structure. There are things happening all around you, and you keep looking around and finding them. The feeling of it being just like any other day follows once you get off the train and you make your way to the test chamber. Well, that is unless, like me, you cheat with the console and spend 30 minutes or so abusing and shooting innocent scientists because, my god, what are you doing, is the funniest line in the history of video games. Look, I mean, someone made a mod called Scientist Slaughterhouse for HL1, so I doubt I'm alone here. You can bother scientists in less homicidal ways if you wish. Don't forget to repeatedly press the microwave and blow up the lunch that's cooking in there because that's canon. No, seriously, that is canon, and if you don't blow up the lunch, then you will eventually create a time paradox that obliterates Gordon and dooms the world to eternal Combine Wall. Okay, maybe not, but do it anyway. Every Half-Life playthrough must start with half an hour to an hour of scientist-based fun before finally turning off the cheats and proceeding through as normal. Anyway, the test chamber happens, unforeseen consequences happen, and the game begins in earnest. Gordon, his HEV suit, his crowbar, and all the other weapons that will help him defeat the headcrabs, zombies, vortigaunts, and all the other alien species who are suddenly here thanks to the resonance cascade. The actual plot of Half-Life is quite simple. You are only driven by a couple of things. First off, you have to get to the surface, and then you must go to the Lambda Labs at the other end of Black Mesa. You don't know what is actually here for most of the game, although whatever it is might actually solve this mess. It obviously becomes clearer that Black Mesa were involved in some very shady things, which is kinda why the military come with the aim of wiping out everyone, scientists included, in order to cover up the fact that Black Mesa have kinda been playing around with aliens for all this time. As much as the last portion of the game comes out of nowhere, Gordon himself was never privy to such information. He never knew what was inside of that test capsule. He doesn't need to know such things. He knows at least to be thankful for hazard suits. He's a strange hero to place, isn't he? Kinda like Link, Gordon has become the mascot for the protagonist as an avatar for yourself, something further boosted by all we know about his background being so mundane. And yet there must be some reason why the G-Man takes such an interest in him. As it is, the Gordon Freeman hero type is still one that gets lots of play today, as does Half-Life's usage of scripted events. Many FPSs or games as a whole still follow that formula of changing areas completely once you get near them thanks to a thing happening. All that feels modern too. What feels less modern is of course the corridor aspect of Half-Life, meaning that you tend to face enemies in small spaces most of the time, peeking around corners and so on. What this means is that in Half-Life, you tend to face smaller groups of enemies more often, as opposed to larger hordes that would be more comfortable in bigger spaces. Even a space that HL would consider big usually only features around 4 to 5 enemies. What's changed is that FPS games these days tend to feature a lot more open spaces. Enemies approach you from different angles, you can approach them from different angles, there's more scope for enemies to enter an area, and you as a player have to be more creative with your cover instead of just hiding behind the nearest wall. For the most part, a wall is sufficient in HL1, especially when enemies tend to rush you instead of waiting for you to come. The enemies themselves all have an important place in Half-Life. Some are highly aggressive, whereas some are more distracting. The headcrab is always great at being annoying, especially when facing other enemies along with it. Vortigaunts make for good stopgaps, often making sure you have to pause and deal with them before anything else. The grunts that you end up facing, both human and alien, will chase you down to the ends of the earth, while also being intelligent enough to force you out of hiding with grenades and rushes. And then there's strange ones like the Hound Eye and the Barnacle. Hound Eyes are great at alerting other enemies to your presence. The Barnacle is, if broken down, no more than a straight vertical line from the top. But that tongue, while often used in puzzles and to promote careful movement, can have several moments of ingenious application throughout the series. The effectiveness of enemies often depends on the environment they're in. The corridors that you often operate in can be advantageous to the humans, for example, but less advantageous to the more alien species. There's always a corner you can hide away in. Of course, there's one exception to that: Zen, the border world that the scientists have been using. Zen is the big controversial part of Half-Life, the end of the game where you jump into a portal and suddenly find yourself in an alien world where everything changes, including how the game plays. Of course, there's less gravity, meaning there's lots of huge jumping puzzles, but then HL1 does have a few of those anyway. What really changes is the open spaces. Suddenly the game's full of them, and the amount of enemies you face in a situation rises sharply. One particular enemy benefits greatly from this: the enslaved Vortigaunts. Vortigaunts appear from the beginning of the game, and they charge up hit scan based energy blasts when they see you. They hurt a lot, but you avoid them simply by breaking the line of sight before they fire, like going into cover. They're kind of like archviles from Doom. Vorties are for the most part very easy enemies to deal with for most of the game. They're weak and they're awful in corridors, but then you get to Zen with its big open spaces, lack of cover, and Vortigons dotted all around. In the plot, you're now on the Vorties' home pitch, and they go from being an easy enemy to deal with to being the most dangerous enemies in the game short of boss monsters, simply because of the wide open spaces that they're in. It's quite interesting how Half-Life completely changes the danger of this one enemy type through the environment they occupy, as opposed to just making them faster or stronger. It's one example of the entirely new ways and methods that Half-Life applies to the FPS. Zen always gets a mixed reaction from people because it's so different. Particularly at the time, it was common opinion to say that most of Half-Life 1 was great, but it was a shame about Zen. Weirdly enough, lots of games use big arena type spaces these days, meaning that Zen is one of the more modern feeling parts of HL1, mostly. People did rightly dislike other things though, such as the energy pools that you have to spend a frickin' age in just to regain your health. And few would say much good about the last boss of the game. As much as the game builds up to Nihilanth and still delivers strong story moments like the reveal of the Vortigons being an enslaved race, it's just not much of a fight really. Shoot the crystals, open that head up, get in there and get to work with your crowbar. The only real danger is either from accidentally killing yourself on a trampoline or constantly being taken to other areas that aren't the boss fight with the portals he fires. And yes, he does look something like a giant baby. That's kind of old banter. On the whole though, yeah, I still enjoy playing Half-Life now. I think it's bloody great. There are annoyances, several parts where you have to fall and take damage, which can be a major nuisance if you're low on health. Sometimes an area's entrances and exits can be needlessly obtuse, like they hadn't got the colours right and that sort of thing. The odd level that slows things down a little bit too much, like On a Rail, which of course started the series' tradition of inconsistent vehicle sections. We'll talk more about that in HL2. But what's great about Half-Life largely still is the usually simple but worthwhile little puzzles that break up the action, the fantastic world that the game builds, and the satisfaction that's present in using most every weapon in the game. As far as that goes, it's a lot more satisfying in that regard than Half-Life 2 is. It's still a nice and not all that long experience too, about 10 hours all told. For all the things that happen in Half-Life, the game is freaking dense, there's never nothing happening, and it's hard to get bored with it. It's still one of the most important and most influential FPSs ever, even if people aren't necessarily reading from the whole of the book anymore, and still a largely fantastic game. And with that, the 5-year road to Half-Life 2 began. There's a fair bit of other stuff we could cover here. Obviously there's the big multiplayer side of things where Half-Life and in particular its mods such as Team Fortress and Counter-Strike arguably innovated even more than the game's single player. There are the two main expansion campaigns by Gearbox, the well-received Opposing Force, which dealt with the story of Adrian Shepard, a military grunt who is assigned to deal with the Black Mesa incident but ends up grabbing the attention of the G-Man, and Blue Shift, covering the story of Barney, one of Black Mesa's many vaguely southern security guards who are intent on buying Gordon Freeman a beer later on. There's the PS2 port, complete with another exclusive expansion called Decay, as well as the aborted Dreamcast version. Not to mention a whole host of custom single-player mods to go along with the multiplayer stuff, more than enough to keep people going on the game for an age. The design for Half-Life 2 went much the same way as Half-Life 1. Get the small teams in to go over every little bit of the game piece by piece, gradually building a design document with the help of writers for consistency. And of course it was hardly smooth sailing. There was a big leak of the game's source code in 2003, along with an estimated shipping date of November of that year that by most accounts was wholly unrealistic. The concept of Valve time became very apparent during the making of Half-Life 2. Much like the original game, Half-Life 2 ended up missing the 2003 date by a whole year, finally coming out on November 16, 2004. The game was also the first to require the installation of a little program by the name of Steam, even for retail copies. Originally made for Valve games only, Steam was made in order to make it easy for updates to be rolled out. It was far from plain sailing at first. People didn't like the product, and the extra step to playing the game could be troublesome, especially if you weren't online. It would be another year or so before the first third-party games started appearing on the platform, and the rest is history. Of course, that's a different story altogether. For now, we're looking at Half-Life 2. Having been placed in stasis by the G-Man at the end of Half-Life 1, Gordon wakes up some 20 years later into a wholly different world. The Black Mesa incident was catastrophic. It caused portal storms to open up around the world, releasing aliens from other dimensions. And then the Combine came along. An all-conquering race that tore the combined armies of the Earth apart in no less than 7 hours. The world is now under Combine control, spared by the negotiations, or more aptly surrender, of Dr. Wallace Breen, the former administrator of Black Mesa who now leads humanity. There are no children in Half-Life 2 because the Combine's repression field has made everybody infertile. This is all the sort of thing that in a lot of games would be told in like a 30-minute cutscene or something like that. In Half-Life 2 you just get little snippets of it, newspaper clippings here and there. Again, it's that sort of thing that adds to the immersion. HL2's world building, from the first looks at the very Soviet indeed City 17, to the messages from Wallace Breen, all the way down to pick up that can, are just as eventful as HL1, even if it's not necessarily as on rails and doesn't take as long. Soon enough, Gordon's discovered by Barney, who is a part of the Combine's civil protection but secretly bats for the resistance, and from there you get to join up with familiar colleagues such as Isaac Kleiner and Eli Vance, both of whom are based on HL1's generic scientist models. It's pretty much agreed on that this is Eli in Half-Life 1. You only see him right after the Cascade with a colleague who maybe was supposed to be Isaac? If so, then his model was changed from the Einstein model to the Walter model, named after a character that appeared in Blue Shift. And of course there's Eli's daughter Alex, who we will get to. Once again, the aim is fairly simple. Get out of the city and go to Black Mesa East, then to Nova Prospect, the Combine's prison, and finally to the Citadel itself, the huge headquarters of Dr. Breen and the Combine in the middle of City 17. HL2's formula is pretty similar to the first games, although it's a lot more refined. The levels are for the most part tighter than ever and filled with even more things that are happening. In fact, the amount of action set pieces is so large that they require 2 vehicle-based sections in order to fit them all in. I think of Half-Life 2 in many ways as like Valve trying to make an action movie. It's got movie-style stunts and set pieces, and even the shootouts play out like they would in an action movie, with the Combine forming positions, moving in and out of cover in ways we'd not often seen in games before that point, right down to their final cries of death and usual theatric ragdoll falling off of something. If there ever was a Half-Life 2 movie, it probably wouldn't look that much different to the game. It's a game full of ideas, that's for sure. It's certainly a lot more bombastic than Half-Life 1 as a result, and Gordon's getting chased down by helicopters in the first 10 minutes of the game. And it's got the physics too, thanks to the new Source engine. That's why the Combine flail about so madly. HL2 certainly showed off physics a lot, although the original game only actually features a couple of seesaw puzzles in which you find objects that can weigh down one side of, say, a plank in order to create a ramp. Physics engines were very common after Half-Life 2, and plenty of other games would take HL2's example and overuse it greatly to the point where overuse of physics became something of a meme, and that was annoying, but it wasn't really Half-Life 2's fault. Half-Life 2 generally uses it very well. As with Half-Life 1, there's no stage of the game that isn't eventful. They're all packed with stuff and try to do their own thing, as if they're all a bunch of people consciously trying to perform a masterstroke. One effect this has is that discussion of Half-Life 2 can result in wildly different opinions as to what stages are best and which ones just don't work. Everyone has their own favourite and least favourite portions of the game. Does this mean that Half-Life 2 isn't exactly the most consistent of games? Yeah, a little, although the journey as a whole still makes it a great frickin' game. In any case, when every stage tries to stand out so much, it's only fair to tell you where I stand on these important issues. The opening, from point insertion to root canal, is, yeah, pretty good. Most people would agree with that one. It sets the whole scene up very nicely, gives you the crowbar and gets you used to working with the physics engine and taking on the Combine. And that's followed by the first vehicle-based section, Water Hazard, in which you command an airboat and attempt to make your way out of the city with a chopper in hot pursuit. This is one of the more polarising sections, as vehicle bits often are in FPSs. Personally, Water Hazard is one of my favourite chapters. The length is just about right, there's tons of really fun jumps and stunts, there's only a couple of stoppages in it, and there's a challenging boss fight at the end. I really like it. Whenever I replay Half-Life 2, Water Hazard is one of the chapters that I look forward to the most. It's certainly a lot better than the other vehicles section, and it helps to establish just how large City 17 actually is, sort of like a more action-packed tram ride. After hooking up with Eli at Black Mesa East and getting a hold of the gravity gun, a weapon unlike no other that takes more advantage of those physics, you then go to perhaps the most polarising chapter of them all, Ravenholm. Some love this and some hate it. One thing's for sure is that it's certainly very different. Ravenholm is HL2's survival horror section. This dark, abandoned town filled with zombies where you're guided by Father Grigori, controlling his congregation with the aid of his rifle. Some say that it's very incongruous with what comes before and after, which it is and it isn't. Half-Life did originally start out as a survival horror game after all. It moved well beyond that, but I guess that people at Valve still wanted to scratch that itch. You do get prepared a little for it. Things like the headcrab zombies in HL2 are always quite unsettling due to how they appear to be in constant pain and they're always there. It gives you a feeling that something like this might be coming, although it being an entire level is something of a surprise. The maze-like design of it can also irritate a little too, although it doesn't take too much to find your way back if you don't get lost, it's not that big. I kinda like Ravenholm personally. Along with the survival horror stuff, it also functions as a good opportunity to get used to the gravity gun. Valve tried to make the most out of this unique weapon here, with plenty of traps that can be activated using it, as well as a general lack of ammo guiding you towards experimenting with the gun. After Ravenholm, it does still remain a largely useful weapon for most of the game, even if it's just a distraction or something to launch objects at the enemy with until the last levels of the game. It does come in very handy a lot of the time. A nice job, to be honest, as it would be easy for such a weapon to just be a one and done gimmick. For me, the sections following Ravenholm are easily the weakest part of the game. I don't like the mine section that's straight after it, and it's followed by Highway 17, the second vehicle section. This is the only part of the game that I really don't like at all. Not much happens in the actual driving, controlling the buggy is kind of awkward, and it's so stop-start. Seriously, you drive for a minute, then you stop and have to deal with some enemies, or help the resistance fend off an attack, or go under a bridge to turn off a gate, which for me is the single worst part of the game. I really don't like anything about Highway 17, and it's an easy pick for me as the worst chapter. Fortunately, the game improves quickly after that. Hell, it's rock solid the rest of the way. I used to not like Sand Traps, a puzzle-based section where the floor is lava and you have to avoid touching it so as not to bother the antlions, but I enjoyed it more here when I figured out that you don't just have to progress very slowly by using the gravity gun to fling bits of rubble everywhere. It's quite fun actually. Nova Prospect and Entanglement? Yeah, they're great. It's all about antlions and Alex helping you kick ass, and the surroundings are good. Any crap's worth it for Anti-Citizen 1 and Follow Freeman, squads of the Resistance doing your bidding, fighting with the Striders. And the Citadel itself? 3 words. Super Gravity Gun. So really, there's only one major low point for me, one section where you're driving a buggy, and at the very least it still keeps you busy because the key part of Half-Life is that things never stop happening. That's something a lot of the shooters inspired heavily by HL2 tended to forget. If you want to make an FPS like Half-Life, then you need to keep things exciting, all the time. Something like Duke Nukem Forever, for example, is a Half-Life 2 inspired shooter where much less things happen, and because of that it's repetitive and dull. If HL2 didn't have the set pieces it had, it would suffer the same fate, but there's still a pace about it, with important sections of downtime that only add to the suspense and anticipation. As you can probably imagine, most of these levels were made by entirely different teams. They tested many things down to the last detail and made them as packed as possible. And still, despite this, Half-Life 2 hands together as a whole, integrating and flowing very well for the most part. It seems to me that people don't really make shooters a lot like Half-Life anymore. Nowadays you tend to have different formulas. There's the open world game like Far Cry, where you take on missions at your leisure and there's all sorts of side things to do. These games do take elements from Half-Life, although the package is totally different. The older school types are still around more than ever, big arena-based shooters like the new Doom and to a lesser extent Wolfenstein. Call of Duty still somewhat flies the flag for cutscenes in gameplay and a lot of things happening, but that game's single-player campaigns really are not what they were back in the glory days of COD 4. Also, the puzzle element is something that a lot of these games have lost along the way. Although some games overuse them, they do break up the action fairly nicely in Half-Life 2. However, at some point, puzzling and platforming in FPSs became a big no-no for quite a while. It's only recently that it started to come back in. Outliers like Mirror's Edge can be thanked, although you can also point to the new Doom, again, and perhaps Dying Light as well. Even then, Half-Life isn't exactly a parkour type game where you jump around quickly with a flow. You have to consider those jumps, otherwise they will screw you. So perhaps Half-Life 2's influence has become a little normalised over time. Every game has ragdoll physics now, games have merged story and gameplay for years, and so on. But it still sure is fun. It is still for me an ideal for an FPS, particularly because it's lean and mean, as are all of Valve's games. The open world games chock full of secrets and side quests and all that hold less appeal for me, because I think they end up being that little bit too bloated. I tend to really enjoy something like a Far Cry game for a while, but then I get kinda bored because I spend too much time screwing around. The Half-Life games though? They're pretty short. Half-Life 1 and 2 both come in at around about 8 to 10 hours each. The 2 episodes we got are probably about the same added up, and there's very little wasted time in either of them. Just a buggy section here, a water-based section there. If there's one thing I miss about a lot of FPSs these days, it's Half-Life's forward motion, something that you're always totally in control of. And again, that's not to say there isn't downtime, but it's appropriate and adds to the suspense, unlike something like a COD campaign that features no downtime at all and thus ends up being kinda one note before too long. Is it always necessary to learn new skills to level up someone who should probably be pretty skilled already? I don't think so, to be honest. Another thing about Half-Life 2 is, it just manages to get its characters so spot on. All of them, without exception, feel natural and real. They're brilliantly acted, they don't even have that many corny script lines. When you look at something like Half-Life and see how it managed to get things so right in 2004, you wonder why so many games struggle with it now. Look at Alex Vance. She's a brilliant partner because the game keeps things so simple. She handles herself in firefights without being so good that she basically plays the game for you, she doesn't get in the way all of the time, and her character actually feels realistic. Dr. Breen is a fantastic villain without being in any way over the top. The other characters, from Izzy to Barney, Eli to Judith, all great, they feel human. And consider also that Valve never used any motion capture for the game or anything like that. All of this natural and subtle facial animation was achieved through sliders and the like. I do wonder how come so few games managed to get it right like Half-Life did. Is it the Hollywood influence? Are more and more games looking a bit too inward these days and only being inspired by other games? Is there too much box ticking and executive meddling going on? Is Mark Laidlaw just that good a writer? I'm not sure. Half-Life 2 isn't necessarily perfect, but it's not all that far away. The episodes did their part as well, particularly the fantastic episode 2, which added yet more strands to the story and a few more amazing sequences before leaving us on that unbelievable cliffhanger. It seems like we'll never know what happens next, whether we'd actually be able to take out the advisors, whether Judith is still alive or not, and how Alex and Gordon take revenge for the person that they just lost. Valve seemed to get themselves a bit sidetracked, and as time's gone on, the prospect of Half-Life 3 has just gotten further and further away. Most of the people who used to work on Half-Life are long gone. Most of the people at Valve seem to work on things that aren't games. They're notoriously secretive so that you never truly know what's going on over there, but the words we've got recently don't inspire much confidence. Who can say that Half-Life 3, if it ever came out, would be anything like what came before it? But it seems to have been lost. Hopefully one day someone will find it again and finish the story, because quite frankly, the game doesn't deserve to be lost, and Half-Life deserves to fully reclaim the status it should have as one of the greatest game series there ever was. Bye for now. You know what, the games industry sure does suck at a lot of things. No matter how good the games might be at any given time, there's always going to be something to complain about. It could be irritating exclusives, or microtransactions, or various dodgy practices. But there is one thing that remains evergreen. The games industry is shit at taking care of their old IPs and preserving their classics. Think of the folks at the BBC who taped over all those old episodes of Doctor Who from the 1960s and multiply it. Realise that there are games from the last generation, officially released ones at that can barely be played now, certainly not through official means. Or games where the source code literally ended up in the trash, or others where the entire IP is an absolute mess of crap wherein no one knows just who owns the rights to what, and frankly the people who do own the rights don't care enough to do anything about it. Such is the case with today's series, featuring two games that are often regarded as two of the greatest PC games ever released. Untying the Gordian knot that is the status of No One Lives Forever is no mean feat, and it is something that we're going to try to do closer to the end of this video. But first off, I just want to go back to it. The appetite for this game is still pretty strong, even though it's getting close to, Jesus, 20 years old. Horror at advancing age aside, this is a game that people still love. Good thing too, as it's thanks to people who love the game that it's still playable on modern computers, regardless of where it stands. It's one of the top games that people always clamour for in terms of a re-release or a revival. There are people who would quite literally kill to step into the high heels of Kate Archer once again, whether in a new adventure or a remastered edition of the old ones. Perhaps because, well, I'm not sure if there's really been another game quite like it. So why exactly is this game so freaking good? The brass tacks of the game are quite simple. No One Lives Forever was released by Monolith for the PC in 2000. The game spent a good couple of years knocking around in development, with things getting serious after the release of their previous game, 1998's Shogo Mobile Armor Division. One of those games that tries to do a ton and is the very definition of interesting but flawed. Monolith recognised this and wanted a game that kicked on from their previous efforts, producing a tighter, more intelligent package that learned from Shogo's mistakes. And so in comes this action stealth FPS with a big old spy event. Now spies made a triumphant return to call in the mid-late 90s, with efforts ranging from the classic and serious to the hilariously parodial. I think that the success of everything from the revivals of James Bond and Mission Impossible to Austin Powers is reflected in games as a whole, let alone just this one. It's no surprise that Monolith would try and do this sort of game, although they tried to go for less obvious sources than, say, the modern adventures of 007 or the ridiculous machinations of Dr. Evil and company. Instead they reached back to more classic efforts such as the Owlman Flint series, The Saint, and Get Smart. It's also perhaps not surprising that originally the protagonist was supposed to be a bloke. However, Monolith very much intended for the game not to be just a straight up riff on Bond, who had especially managed to sink his hooks into games thanks to, well, you know, one of the most popular and critically acclaimed licensed games ever. They did kind of find the male protagonist to be kind of limiting in this regard, and so it was gender swap time. The introduction of Kate Archer not only helped to give the game a more unique stand-in, but also allowed for much more creativity in terms of fun gadgets and the like, which you definitely see in the game. The production was expensive, especially seeing as it included the production of a whole new engine in Lift Tech. It took quite a while to find a publisher, and the dev cycle at points did leave Monolith weeks from the receivers, but ultimately Fox Interactive jumped on board, and the game, complete with the full title of The Operative No One Lives Forever, was released in November 2000. Upon its release, it was immediately classed as one of the best first-person shooters since 1998's Half-Life. Anyway, it's the 1960s and you play as Kate Archer, a well-to-do, sophisticated lady and former cat burglar who works for the British counter-terrorism organisation Unity. She does have one thing in common with Bond: she's Scottish. Not that you would particularly know from the accent. The character's Scottish accent was more pronounced early on, but it was soon changed to something more generic British and posh.
You're not going to kill her? What if she wakes up?
Now look here, you. I'm not going to butcher a fellow countryman without a specific grudge. If she wakes up, she can fend for herself. If she dies, then she ain't really a Scot, so I won't feel bad.
You control Kate for a whole bunch of missions, with an overarching story joining them all together. Now first off, well, Kate is pretty obviously an awesome character. The design alone, that hair and ultra-garish catsuit, make her very memorable indeed. She carries explosives in lipstick and poison gas in bottles of perfume, has no end of sass and is more than ready for a fight. She's pretty awesome without trying too hard for it. She certainly fits right into the game's world, which is that classic hyper-real vision of the 60s, much like what you'd find in Austin Powers. The difference being that while Lost in Powers' obvious parody, Monolith tried to make No One Lives Forever a little bit straighter. The actual story and themes are a bit less of a parody. So what you end up with is basically a good old whip-cracking spy yarn. Many a great character and many a great scene. There's tons of 60s references, and Monolith's love for the decade and all the classic spy works they researched is clear. It's pretty clear that they can write a damn good game too. While it's not strictly a parody, that doesn't mean that the game isn't funny as hell a lot of the time, almost having that LucasArts vibe to it. The story itself revels in its cliched nature. Kate is frustrated waiting for her first mission, she finally gets her chance, and the entire thing is a botch job wherein both the person that they were supposed to protect and her mentor end up Costa del Blowfly. She escapes, and despite the dim view taken of her by her bosses, she ends up on more missions as, well, she's the only choice there is. And from there she proves herself and ends up taking on Harm, the big villain organisation hell-bent on taking over the world. It's your classic introduction origin story, but plenty of fun for it and full of intrigue. The action itself is chock full of set pieces too. No One Lives Forever definitely plays a lot at offering more than just typical shooting action. You've got vehicle sections, shooting galleries, clue hunting, the famous skydiving without a parachute section, and even a part where Kate ends up in frickin' space. Yeah, the game does get rather extreme by its finale. There's a lot of these, of course, being that this is an early 2000s game and such drastic changes in gameplay were commonplace. But the core itself is just fine. The action itself is as sharp as any classic FPS from the time, not one at all with the controls, perfectly easy to shoot folks and lots of good gunfights. There isn't anything about the gunplay which especially stands out aside from the aforementioned set pieces, but it's absolutely fine. The stealth is where things get a bit more interesting, of course. No One Lives Forever does have a fair bit in common with another all-time great FPS that was released in 2000 and is somewhat more available today, Deus Ex. While No One Lives Forever lacks that game's RPG-style leveling system, both games utterly revel in gadgets and the virtues of being hidden in plain sight. And if a barrette that doubles up as both a lockpick and a poisoned dagger sounds awesome to you, you've come to the right place. Not to mention the aforementioned explosive lipstick, using a cigarette lighter as a welder, or simply disposing of bodies with a quick spray that'll disintegrate the unfortunate cadaver in seconds. The multitude of gadgets offers a bit of replay value too. One of the big parts of the game is collecting as much intel as you can. Not only does it add to your score, but a lot of it's genuinely worth seeking out as it adds more to the story, while again being quite amusing, much like the funny conversations you often get to eavesdrop on. You won't be able to get close to all the intel at first as you'll lack the required gadgets, but after earning items like the mine detector or belt hook shot, you'll be able to replay levels, find the secrets, and hopefully improve your score. This certainly does add a bit of replay value, along with items often being in different places when you replay the missions. Problems? A couple of typical ones for sure, often relating to the stealth, it has to be said. The game's stealth is very early 2000s, the sort where guards often seem to have supernatural abilities when it comes to spotting you, meaning that you can't so much as peek around a corner without being seen. Sneaking in FPS games was pretty rough back then, and you obviously get a lot more feedback now when it comes to how hidden you actually are. Now while it's not the end of the world if you mess up stealth, it is somewhat annoying to then go through whole missions with alarms blaring and what have you. It's like a sudden switch to a wholly different game. Other than that, the game's AI isn't super smart or anything, and you can pick them apart from a distance with most of your weapons. The game's not exactly super hard in the regular settings, and should be a breeze for anyone who's competent at FPS. Still, this isn't so much a game you look at for a challenge as much as you do for the variety and the fun that's on offer. Again, it's quite a lot like Deus Ex in that regard, only with a snappier script and more killer one-liners. If you want to forego stealth entirely and just go in there all guns blazing, there's nothing stopping you, it's not mandatory. Nor do you have to obsess over score and getting all the items, you can just revel in the story instead. It's a pretty great game no matter what you decide to do, full of vibrancy and charm, sparkling with wit, a truly romantic spy yarn. basically the opposite of Floor 13, but bloody marvellous. The original No One Lives Forever was, thankfully, an unbridled success, loved by all just about. A sequel was pretty much inevitable, and it would arrive in 2002. No One Lives Forever 2, A Spy in Harm's Way. Following on a year from the events of the first game, the much more experienced Kate Archer is set to be a part of frosty US-Soviet relations once again, while thwarting Harm's attempts to set the world afire and, as usual, having something of a smart mouth ready for villains and employers alike. No One Lives Forever 2 is, as it turns out, yep, pretty damn good again. A fair bit darker than the original game in many ways, the stakes become a fair bit heavier in this one. The snappy dialogue and humour is still very much there, of course. You'll get plenty of funny notes and conversations, much like in the first game, but you'll also get plenty of drama and serious peril. Hell, the first mission ends with our heroine nursing a stab wound, close to death. Now obviously she survives, it wouldn't exactly be much of a game if she didn't, but while Kate is now a seasoned veteran, she's hardly invincible. The game also smooths out a lot of the original's rough edges. You get a lot of technical improvements and refinements. The stealth, one of the weaker points of the original, is greatly improved. Kate can now lean around corners and have a peek at what's going on without risking immediately getting spotted. There's a great deal more ways to distract, incapacitate or otherwise kill enemies. I mean, in the original you basically had the option of either evading or killing, and now if you want to play as pacifist as possible, it's a lot easier. You can knock an enemy out and get rid of their weapons before they wake up, for example. Tracking enemies is now also an important part of the game. You can mark enemies with a special gun and they'll appear on your compass. The body remover from the first game is also gone. While quite a fun and unique gimmick, its limited usage did at times make it a bit of a pain. So now Kate's grown a bit more muscle since the last game, and she can drag bodies out of the way so that they don't get spotted. And also you have an idea now of how well hidden you are. It's much more polished. The gunplay itself hasn't changed much, and you still get most of the awesome gadgets, plus a few new additions. These were all great things about the original, and they've not really changed. The ability to lean, if anything, improves them too, and the AI is a little bit smarter, even if it's not necessarily the brightest by today's standards. There are some other little accoutrements that can be handy. You have a compass now, which gives you an idea of where you need to go, and you also have skill points to increase Kate's skills even further. Now these are more like bonuses. It's not like, say, Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness, where seasoned explorer Lara Croft is suddenly too weak to pull a bloody lever, but it turns Kate from a pretty darn good spy into a super spy by game's end. A lot of these improvements may sound familiar, and I think it's fair to say that No One Lives Forever 2 is in many ways highly inspired by Deus Ex. The original was Deus Ex's contemporary, of course, both arrived in the same year, and the sequel is more than happy to take lessons from it. Not that there's anything wrong with taking notes from one of the best FPSs of all time, mind you. There's even more of an effort to fill levels with multiple paths that allow for far more interaction with NPCs, that are filled with lots of intel and other secrets to find, and also feature plenty of side objectives away from the typical ones that you have to do. The original was a much more direct game, focused on set pieces, and while No One Lives Forever 2 has plenty of that, it also often tries to make its levels into expansive, living and breathing hubs. The aforementioned skill point system, one that was popularised by Deus Ex, is also a clue. NOLF 2's isn't as in-depth, but it's certainly there. In the end, if you like Deus Ex, and who doesn't, then you'll certainly like this. Hell, you could almost say that NOLF 2 is a fine sequel to Deus Ex, in a way that Invisible War was not. You know, if you completely change the protagonist, setting, and time. The much more expansive levels and improvements in just about every area definitely make No One Lives Forever 2 a keeper. It's everything you would expect from a damn fine sequel, no doubt about it. Monolith kept up with the times. The differences between this game and the first are actually a convenient way to show just how quickly the first-person genre was evolving, as the series had come so far in just 2 short years. It was rightly praised to high heavens again, even going as far as to win the title of PC Game of the Year in a couple of publications. No One Lives Forever had been such a great title for Monolith too. Previously, games like Blood and Shogo had shown their potential, even if they came with the odd flaw. But with these two games, they'd released their first stone cold classics, and they had cemented themselves as one of the bigger developers going, and a pretty hot one too. A title which they still hold today. No One Lives Forever is a big part of that. Indeed, what did happen next? When you've got such a hot series on your hands, you would expect to see more. And there is one more game that took place in the universe, Contract Jack, released in 2003. Jack, standing for Just Another Contract Killer, puts you in the shoes of John Jack, an assassin working for harm and dealing with another criminal organisation known as Danger Danger, and the events of the game take place between the two No One Lives Forever games, with basically no involvement from Kate Archer or Unity. Spin-offs where you play as the evil team can be fun, but alas, TIE Fighter this is not. The game didn't really succeed. It was somewhat more simplistic than the excellent NOLF 2, the characters and humour weren't as good. It didn't make much of an impact. No matter though, it's just a spin-off and surely the adventures of Kate Archer would continue. But no, this is actually the last game set in the No One Lives Forever universe. So why did the series come to such an abrupt end? The main duo who'd produced the game, Chris Miller and Samantha Ryan, were certainly fond of it, especially Chris. In 2004, Monolith were acquired by Warner Bros. Interactive, and from then on they would release titles under the WB Games label. Their first game, The Matrix Online, a co-production with Sega, was not exactly a hit, alas, but their second game was. Fear, released in 2005, was the start of another hugely successful and critically acclaimed series. They also released Condemned, an excellent Xbox 360 launch title, in the same year. Suddenly they'd switched from spy capers to serious survival horror. One thing to note about Monolith is that they aren't the biggest developers around, nor are they the most prolific. Years can pass from one proper Monolith game to another. So perhaps Fear set them on a new path, one where No One Lives Forever just fell by the wayside. This policy of fully devoting themselves to one or at most two games until they're done tends to pay off for them. After years away, a time when you would almost have forgotten that they existed, they came roaring back again in 2014 with Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor, another hugely loved and mega popular title. So this is not a story where the developer ended up abruptly closing its doors. Monolith were and are a big name in the industry. If there was to be a third No One Lives Forever game, theoretically they could work on it. The weird status of No One Lives Forever, in the end, all comes down to rights. It turns out that the rights to the game are a massive melting pot, filled with existing entities that barely talk to each other, most of whom have no idea about the actual status of the game and lack the motivation required to sort things out. It's not like people aren't interested. The company Night Dive, one that specialises in taking old games, giving them a bit of a prim, and then re-releasing them on sites like GOG.com, applied for the trademark to No One Lives Forever in 2014, confident that getting it sorted wouldn't be much of an issue. The source code for both games had long been out there for a start, and anyone who'd developed the game was well up for it. All was good, until they came across a quite ridiculous trifecta. 3 big companies, all of which potentially had a claim to the IP. It was enough for Night Dive to ultimately give up on re-releasing No One Lives Forever, sadly deciding it was a lost cause. So yeah, it's not good. What is this trifecta then? Well, first off, I have to give credit to Kirk Hamilton, who wrote a piece for Kotaku called The Sad Story Behind a Dead PC Game That Can't Come Back in 2015 about the series. He's done the necessary digging in order to try and determine the quite unfortunate status of the IP, and his article will very much be our guide. I mean, when someone's done such a sterling job, it would be foolish to not give praise where it's due. Anyway, the big 3 are Warner Bros., you probably guessed that one, 20th Century Fox, who had a hand in publishing the first game, and Activision, who, Well, they didn't have any involvement in the series at all, but were potentially involved due to their merger with Vivendi in 2008, who purchased Fox Interactive, the actual publishers of the first game, in 2003. Seeing as Warner Bros. Owned both Monolith and the Liftech engine that the games were made on, naturally Night Dive went to them first. However, WB were cagey about doing a deal, as they thought that Activision had some control over the series. And so Night Dive went to them. Activision were helpful, but they didn't really know. They thought that it was possible they had a claim, but that any records of it predated digital storage. So, you know, somewhere there might be a contract in a dusty box that hasn't been opened for many years. Stephen Kick and Larry Cooperman, the main men at Night Dive doing these negotiations, likened it to the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Night Dive look into things further, browse through the public records and so on, and make a claim on the trademark in May of 2014, and this got people quite excited. However, Warner Bros., still not sure about the whole thing, filed an extension on the trademark shortly after. Not that Night Dive weren't trying to work with WB on the whole thing, they were always on the phone, trying to get something going. However, Warner's response could be described broadly as pessimistic at best, apathetic at worst. As for 20th Century Fox, well, their position was similar to Activision's. They didn't know if they had rights to it or not. Now, Activision are somewhat blameless in this story in that they couldn't really say and basically left it at that. Fox, on the other hand, were different. They offered Night Dive a somewhat crappy deal. Give us some money almost as a sort of guarantee, just so that we can look for our records, and if we don't find anything, then we'll give you that money back. Night Dive didn't take it, and the Fox response was pretty much whatever, with the proviso that if there were much further movement on the release, they'd look themselves, and if they found something, action would be taken. Yay for vague threats of legal action. Speaking of which, another department of Warner Bros., one not even aware of all the negotiations, sends a threat of legal action over to Night Dive saying that they're aware of the trademark filing and that if they continue to pursue it without negotiating a deal, Warner are going to sue their ass. In legalese anyway. Intimidating though this might have been, it was actually a chance to set the lumbering WB machine that Fussar had contributed nothing to the process into action. Night Dive get in touch with Warner's attorney, make him aware of the current negotiations, and he says that he'll see what can be done. He is actually helpful. Alas, in February of 2015, the hammer ended up falling. Warner finally came back saying that they had no interest in publishing the game themselves, and they had no interest in working with Night Dive. The end. All of Night Dive's efforts, which included the making of some marketing materials as well, came to nothing, and they had no choice but to let their claim on the trademark lapse. You look at this whole story and you really wonder, what on earth is with the total passivity? Surely it's a deal that would require a pretty low amount of effort from WB Games for a nice chunk of change at the end of it. Was it the potential added effort of negotiating with two other big companies to give them their piece of the pie if they had claim to it? Or hey, maybe Monolith have secretly been working on a third game all this time. No, it's probably not that. Instead, you seem to have a case of unnecessary corporate red tape and just pure apathy. The feeling one gets from WB is that, well, they could do something about it. They just don't really want to. Night Dive put a ton into NOLF. They knew how high the demand was, they wanted to fix all the bugs, bring the multiplayer back, include a whole raft of modern features and so forth, essentially create a definitive edition for these two classic games. If, despite all these plans, they weren't able to get anything going, it's hard to see who could. At least, officially. For now, people can still play these classics. The fan community for the games have versions of No One Lives Forever available that allow you to play both 1 and 2 on modern operating systems in all resolutions. I've been using them for this video. They even have multiplayer to boot. Now obviously it's not exactly on the up and up, but let's face it, currently there is no way to give Monolith or any company money for this game. Either you're doing it this way, or you're dusting off an ancient physical copy of the game that you probably bought in a second-hand store and then spending hours trying to get it running. For now, no efforts have been made to take these unofficial versions, which you can certainly find with a cursory web search, out of commission, and hopefully it stays that way. Is it ideal? Well, no. In an ideal world, these two classics are celebrated and happily available on Steam and the like for all. But hey, as I said at the start of this video, the games industry sure does suck at a lot of things. The Adventures of Kate Archer may not be cared all that much about by the people who own it, but plenty of people do care. So whatever you do, go out and either revisit these classics or experience them for the first time. What have you got to lose? After all, as the song goes, no one lives forever, and evil never dies. Bye for now. The community gives thanks to the following: Adam Schaefer, Alex Stocco, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Audie Sawley, Conformist, Daniel Briggs, Daniel David Taylor, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Ghostly Spectre, Guatham Blackpool, Hunter, Ian Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Durso, Jason Goy, Jason Leach, Jason Stevens, Johan Eriksson, Josh Jensen, Lee Norris, Mark Johnston, Martin Pataki, Morten Skanin, Nanette McCrone, Nicholas Tristan, Olaf Albin, Peter Jack, Peter Sidorn, Phil Taprog, Pocky Southmaid, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Ryan Burford, Sammy Lee, Scott Coulter, Sean Zoltek, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stephen Warner, The Unnatural, Tanyo J, Yucca Operator, and Zach Roach.